Coast Guard did its part in World War II. Coast Guard officers and men fought and served in every theater of operations. Meeting the challenge of total war, they performed duties entirely new to the service and performed them well. On many distant enemy shores, Coast Guard beachmasters unloaded urgently needed supplies. In the Persian Gulf, picket boats patrolled ports filled with Lend-Lease weapons for Russia. On newly captured Japanese islands, Coast Guard dog patrols routed out hidden enemy snipers. In the invasion waters off Normandy, 83-footers saved over 1,000 lives. In harbors seized from the enemy, buoy tenders prepared the way for Allied shipping. In the North Atlantic, Coast Guard manned vessels reported weather conditions for the guidance of shipping and transoceanic air traffic. Based on Guam, Coast Guard liberators carried high-priority cargo to outlying Lorand stations. But the main job of the service was to man the thousands of Navy, Army, and Coast Guard ships in a war in which every battlefront was thousands of miles from America. Over 80,000 Coast Guard officers and men, more than 6 times the entire peacetime strength of the service, were assigned to over 4,000 vessels of all sizes, ranging from small boats to ocean liners. Large Navy transports manned by Coast Guardsmen ferried great masses of troops across the ocean to return to the United States with prisoners, wounded, and veterans. They manned assault transports, whose landing craft carried soldiers and Marines directly to enemy shores. Coast Guard personnel were assigned to combat cargo ships, bringing supplies and munitions to invasion beachheads. With hundreds of Army freight supply ships, Coast Guardsmen operated an all-important inter-island shipping service in the Pacific. From Sicily to Okinawa, the service manned LSTs, the naval innovation of World War II that revolutionized amphibious warfare. LCIs, landing craft infantry, spearheaded invasions in both the European and Pacific theaters. Even before America's entry into the war, Coast Guard ships and men were in it. Early in 1940, when the war in Europe forced all vessels to maintain radio silence, Coast Guard cutters on patrol duty in the North Atlantic were designated to supply meteorological data for ships and aircraft. Stationed in strategic positions, Coast Guardsmen were able to report German activities and save many survivors of torpedoed Allied vessels. When, in April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark, the danger of a Nazi occupation of Greenland, Denmark's strategically located colony in the Western Hemisphere, became a serious threat, not only to Atlantic shipping, but also to the North American continent. To maintain our neutrality, several cutters were dispatched to patrol Greenland waters. And the service was charged with advising and assisting the Danish authorities in establishing effective defense measures. Representing the United States, the first American consular officials were brought to Greenland by the Coast Guard. Urgently needed food and medical supplies were delivered to the native population, which had depended completely on its imports from Denmark. But of immediate importance was the safeguarding of the world's only known commercial deposit of cryolite, indispensable in the production of aluminum. To protect this mine against sabotage, a number of experienced Coast Guard enlisted men were released from the service to volunteer to work as mine guards for the Greenland government. A thorough topographical survey of the island was made by service personnel. The new charts proved of immeasurable value in navigating the treacherous Greenland waters and in the establishment of air, naval, and weather stations. In strategic places, 3-inch guns were installed by Coast Guardsmen to safeguard vulnerable harbor entrances. As Greenland is the best source of prediction for Europe's weather, radio stations were planted there by Nazis and quislings. Service personnel captured the hidden stations to prevent the broadcasting of weather information to the enemy. As late as December 1944, the Coast Guard was still fighting enemy attempts of infiltration into Greenland.
With Uncle Sam's Arctic Patrol only a few hundred miles from the North Pole, searching for Nazi weather stations along Greenland's iceberg-guarded shores with a task force of Coast Guard cutters. The cutter Northland wedged in dangerous pack ice. Coast Guardsmen skid a depth bomb forward to smash the way. No time to lose. Scout planes report an armed German trawler ahead, so they lower away and blast a path to battle. Off Shannon Island, the Nazi trawler is sighted and American guns cut loose. Meanwhile, from the cutter SHORES, a landing party sets out for Shannon Island to capture the Nazi shore station, well fortified and hidden in the ice fields. Risky hunting for the Coast Guardsmen. Twice before, in 2 months, has this weather-beaten crew ferreted out just such enemy installations. Now they're closing in on number 3, an icy cave camouflaged by snow. In the gathering Arctic darkness, the Germans surrender. 4th Nazi outpost in Greenland captured within a year, plus high-powered radio equipment, weather instruments, food and ammunition. Back to the Coast Guard task force come small boats loaded with the crew of the captured German trawler. First aboard is the Nazi skipper, his men replaced on the German ship by an American prize crew after a battle fought farther north than any on record. Captives of the U.S. Coast Guard, which gets lots of the dirty work and little of the glory.
The experience of the Greenland Patrol was put to good use when the service was called upon to convoy merchant ships in the Atlantic. Scarcely more than a month after Pearl Harbor, the first Nazi submarine struck in American coastal waters, and the real wartime job of the Coast Guard began. Every available vessel was thrown into the fight, which threatened not only America's essential coastal shipping, but also the vital supply lines to our allies. Some cutters took their stations to guard the outer approaches to our coastal waters. Others escorted American and Allied merchant ships across the ocean. It was a Coast Guard cutter that was credited with sinking the first Nazi submarine in American waters. And other cutters were equally successful as sub-busters, as the Battle of the Atlantic became more furious. The successful work of the cutters was augmented by frigates and destroyer escorts, which the Navy turned over to the Coast Guard for manning. A killer group of destroyer escorts played a major part in breaking up the last serious Nazi submarine offensive in 1945. And the Coast Guard personnel manning the ships were given high recognition for this achievement at the war's end. But the Coast Guard suffered losses, too. The 2,200-ton cutter Hamilton was the first American warship torpedoed in the Atlantic. Over 30 Coast Guard manned vessels were lost during World War II in action all over the world. In Washington, the Coast Guard's Commandant, Admiral Russell R. Waesche, summarized the war record of the service.
For nearly all our national history, The Coast Guard has served as the nation's maritime law enforcement and safety at sea body. During the years of peace, it assumed an ever-increasing number of functions to make shipping safe alike from natural menaces and from threats by the lawless. Now, in the midst of a world war, it has joined its forces with the rest of our armed services to put down the menace of aggression and oppression. As an operating part of the Navy, it has manned combat transports and landing craft in combat theaters all over the world. The Coast Guard has been in the vanguard of attack in every major invasion.
In July of 1942, at a time when America's forces were still on the defensive everywhere, a convoy of American ships was underway in the Pacific. Among them was the attack transport Hunter Liggett, a converted luxury liner, one of the first large Navy ships to be manned entirely by Coast Guard personnel. Though the destination of the convoy was secret, it was known that offensive action was ahead. Constant drills were ordered to augment the intensive amphibious training which the crew had already received in the United States. The passengers carried aboard were Marines. Nearly 1,500 battle-trained men of the 1st Marine Division who were to participate in the first invasion of enemy-held territory, 6,000 miles from home. D-Day at 06:53, the Hunter Liggett had stopped 2 miles offshore. At 0800, the loaded LCVPs proceeded toward the beach. It was here that the Coast Guard's skill in the handling of small boats was put to its first test on an invasion. In the weeks to come, as the Marines advanced on the island, Coast Guard ships helped to supply them with munitions and supplies. Three months after the invasion of Guadalcanal, over 800 ships, the largest concentration ever assembled, were on their way to North Africa. In the convoy were the Coast Guard transports Dickman, Wood, and Chase, which were in the vanguard of the assault, landing American and British troops on African soil. First invasion of European soil. And again, Coast Guard ships and men helped to land our troops. For the first time in this war, LCIs and LSTs saw action on the beaches of Scoglietta, Gela, and Licata. The landing barges of transports, which 8 months ago participated in the invasion of Africa, shuttled back and forth with troops and supplies. But the landings were made costly by concentrated enemy air attacks. time had come for a decisive blow at the enemy, and the first assault on the European mainland was about to be effected, soon to be followed by the bitterly contested landing at Anzio. On the other side of the world, Navy and Coast Guardsmen were preparing to land Marines on a tiny atoll. The Japanese fought back furiously. Landing barges of the USS Arthur Middleton were stopped on reefs, and enemy fire took a dreadful toll of American lives. Of the first waves, only 1 man out of 5 survived to get to the beachhead, and to hold on to the small strip of land seized at such a high cost from the enemy. In a steady stream, the landing barges brought the wounded back to the transports. Normandy, the greatest invasion ever undertaken. Here, the Coast Guard manned attack transport Bayfield, served as flagship off Utah Beach. At H hour, landing craft hit the beaches, the beginning of the bloody road to Berlin. For over 30 years, the Japs had been fortifying this hub of the Marianas in preparation for a day like this. But costly experience had taught the landing crews how to get their men ashore under enemy fire. The last of the European invasions was the fastest and least costly of all, for there was little opposition from the enemy in establishing the beachhead. With the landings on the main island of the Philippines, Coast Guard personnel of LSTs, frigates, and such transports as the Callaway, Cambria, Cavalier, Middleton, Mitchell, Wood, and others helped to fulfill the American pledge to return and free the islands from the invader. Although this small island was bombarded by our ships and planes for 3 days and nights, the landing boats attempting to put Marines ashore took terrific punishment, far exceeding anything they had ever experienced. Bloody Iwo, the fiercest battle in the Marine Corps' long history. To offset the high losses, Coast Guard manned LSTs moved in, bringing desperately needed reinforcements and supplies. Easter Sunday, the greatest invasion force ever assembled in the Pacific went into action only 330 miles from the Japanese mainland. The initial stages of the invasion were marked by a surprising lack of enemy resistance, giving no sign of the desperate struggle that was to later encounter our troops inland. The Japanese made a final suicidal attempt with their kamikazes to blast our ships off the sea. The unrelenting fury of continuous sea and air bombardment and the atomic bomb soon brought total defeat to Japan. To foreign shores in the Pacific, American ships again sailed in peace. Greenland, Guadalcanal, Africa, Normandy, Okinawa, and 5 long years of Coast Guard at war ended on the home islands of the crushed Empire of Japan.